When something leaves a stain, even if you wash it out, it's still there, a thinning deep in the fabric.
The story of Candyman is so perennial, and that's part of the reason why it's exciting to tell it in any time period. The cycles of violence and how history repeats itself and how we collectively grieve and process trauma, which is through stories. It's always a time to tell a story like Candyman, which is kind of the big tragedy of the tale in the first place.
This neighborhood got caught in a loop. The shit got stained in the exact same spot, over and over, until it finally rotted from the inside out.
Candyman belonged to the people of Cabrini Green, for better or for worse.
Say his name, if you dare.
I wanted him to be something that kids spoke of with both reverence, mystery, fear, but also pride.
The very question of this eternal dance between monster and victim, the racial history of this country is at the center of this movie. There's a perpetualness to the story of racial horror in this country. It doesn't go away, it changes shape and it changes form, and it's elusive and it's sneaky, right?
Our Candyman puts up a mirror to issues we talk about in the Black community, but it's like a funhouse mirror. And we're saying, hey, take a look at it and see what you see.
The force that is pushing Anthony into the Say My Name piece, you can see it as he uncovers these horrific stories of racial violence. He's gleeful at what he can mine from that. It really represents a cautionary tale for the audience.
They say my name. And say my name.
When Anthony creates the Say My Name piece, he's found a piece of art that he cares about for the first time in a very long time. He's looking at police brutality, historical trauma, victimhood, oppression, and he's excited to be able to create a piece that's going to force people to look in the mirror.
Anthony's piece is exploring his slow realization that there is this perpetual stain of violence in that Cabrini area, and probably subconsciously realizing he's part of it. He's trying to get to the truth of his past.
With Candyman, with talking about unwilling martyrs, I wanted to make sure that we don't forget the life of the person who's killed, because a martyr is a powerful symbol, a monster is a powerful symbol. But at the end of the day, if the name isn't remembered, then what are we really talking about?
Something they used to call Candyman.
The name, the person, the life that was lost, that's the most important thing.
The Robitaille story, of course, is he fell in love with a white woman, committed the ultimate sin, and was chased down by a mob. His hand was cut off, they smeared honey on him and let the bees attack him, and they set him on fire at the area that became Cabrini Green.
Cabrini Green, you had 5 different gang factions operating in the same complex. Fortunately, we had to respect the different gang members. I find it ironic, the same kind of death rate that was going on then is still happening today.
Cabrini is an area where crime became rampant and the neglect of the city became devastating. And bizarre stories and urban legends would come from them of things that happened and violent incidences. The notion is, what if there was an original murder that started all of this?
People say Candyman, but they don't say the name of Danny Robitaille or Anthony McCoy. Say the name of the person. Say Breonna Taylor. Say Jacob Blake.
We're still in a place where even before George Floyd, even before this country erupted in this uprising, that's something that we're still dealing with all the time.
Which I think is really powerful and really important in relation to Candyman. He's not a monster, he's not a martyr. He's Danny Robitaille, a painter who lost his life. Or he's Anthony McCoy, a painter and awkward dude who lost his life. I want to talk about humanity.
This film has been causing me to look at the Eric Garner case a lot in terms of how victims are turned into something other than what they are. Eric Garner, his name became weaponized, became part of a culture, became part of a movement, part of a mobilization. Some people turn it into a monstrous thing. I'm really excited to be making art that's gonna ask, what does it mean to be a victim of injustices that we see in this country? And what does it then mean to turn that victimhood into mobilization of oppressed voices?
You can't just erase pain. You can't just erase that oppressive tradition by knocking down the buildings and putting up a Starbucks.
I kind of looked at gentrification as a force that we're all swept up in, a force that definitely is a form of violence, in particular how it affected this community. And so we really wanted to look at it in a very dynamic way and try to look at the many different sides of it and who's a part of it, who gets swept up in the wave, unwillingly or willingly.
Candyman is about holding on to that truth and the idea that beneath all of that, there's something that's still unresolved.
It's a big idea. The original crime is slavery, right? The original crime that started this was black people were brought here. It was torture. Candyman is, in essence, it's an allegory for racism in America. We tried to bring out the connection with the fact that it's an epidemic of violence on black bodies in this country. Candyman can't just be singular. He's a concept. He's a story. He's a boogeyman. And that means he applies across the boundaries of time. He's eternal.
Tell everyone.
We really wanted to take what I think was done with the first film and apply an even greater sense of urgency. The fact that this monster has been swept under the carpet for so long.
Say his name. I dare you.
Carrying the mantle of Candyman is an honorarium because many are called but few are chosen. It's a carrion cry. It's an eternal scream. It's a person that says, I'm no longer going to take this and I no longer care about the consequences. Callousness, lack of empathy, right is right and wrong is wrong. I wish that Candyman didn't have to exist.
Careful.
The original Candyman, it's a very influential movie for me. It came out in 1992, so I would have been like 13. I was a horror fan, and we didn't have a black Freddy. We didn't have a black Jason. We loved Freddy and Jason. But when Candyman came along, it felt very daring, and it felt very cathartic, and it was terrifying.
So the original Candyman, body horror is such a big part of the story. And for me, body horror is really great because it connects directly to character and to psychological terror. And The Fly is a movie that I looked at because of how masterfully body horror is mixed in with this psychological descent and with this devolution of this relationship. And that's something I'd want to mirror in Candyman. Cronenberg's work was definitely a huge inspiration for me.
And something about infusing a little bit of that idea of the slow transformation, something pure to something corrupted, really delivered exactly what Nia had in mind.
When Anthony first returned to Cabrini Green, he was stung by a bee, and it was sort of like a mark, you know, like the mark that would soon cause everything else to spiral. He was sort of the chosen one, and he picks at it and scratches at it throughout the movie, and it starts as a bump and it evolves into a whole Candyman thing.
You need a hand?
I love the imagery of the scabbing of his hand and the constant picking at the wound because it's a perfect metaphor. As I pick away, then all of a sudden I pick that final scab and then I can't turn back anymore, right?
The rash is a very supernatural element that basically turns his arm into full necrosis of the skin and makes everything go dead. As it spreads out, it starts turning into a honeycomb underneath the skin until it finally erupts.
It was really disgusting, frankly. Find reference images, get reference images, looking at the terrible things that have happened to the human body, and using that to inform what we were making and making it as realistic as possible. Definitely would not like to do that too soon again, but in the context of the film, it was really great to have someone as skilled as Kozar to bring all that stuff to life.
Today we have Burke's kill, so he's got stab wounds on his eye and face from his pen that Brianna stabs into his face.
I did get to stab a foam head version of Coleman. I think I got a little carried away.
I think he's dead.
This is my work. This is my work. This is the result of when you mess with Brianna.
The practical effects were so fun to do. I wanted there to be a visceral reaction from the audience to what was happening to Anthony's body. It was so impressive to see what Kozar could create.
This is the day that I've been looking for. This is the one day that we see the complete Candyman transformation. And yeah, it's gonna be exciting.
When Yaya showed up in horror stuff, I was like, oh, hell no, he's got to get away from me. I can't look at him. Oh!
Yes! Anthony and his team are so talented, and they do everything to make me look good, and at the end of the day, anything to make the acting and the character come to life. That's what we're all going for. I imagine I was just giving you the middle finger, but it's just the hook, so.
So the hook.
we were going to be presenting the audience with a different hook than the one that Tony Todd dons in the original. We wanted to make sure that the hook that Anthony ends up having at the end of the film feels like it was forged by the hands of William Burke, someone who so desperately wanted to remake this character.
My team created the hook based off the concepts, and we made several different variations of the hook. We have a hook that is a hero hook, so it's rigid, could be dangerous in the wrong setting. We have several stunt hooks that are cut off at different lengths, so if someone gets sliced in the neck or up the stomach or something like that, they have that hook that's cut off at that point, so it looks like it could be actually going into them.
The kill scenes were challenging because I think what we realized early on, we were like, oh, how do you maintain tension when you know as soon as you say a fifth Candyman, the people who said it are gonna die?
And so for us, it was like, look, if we're gonna kill people, and we are, we wanna make sure that we do that in as many fun and dynamic ways as possible. And I think not knowing exactly how he's gonna get you next time is partly what keeps you on the edge of your seat.
Say what 5 times in the mirror?
For Candyman, a lot of the conversation became about how this character needs to be kind of just bulldozing in slow motion. So there's a patience and there's a confidence. Those two together becomes pretty horrific. My role is kind of primarily to help develop the character's signature moves and gestures and postures. The rehearsals are kind of doing exercises where you pretend that you have eyes on different body parts. So you pretend that the eyeballs are actually the front of the neck or the back of the neck or on the shoulder blades. So that kind of rearranges the way that you walk through space.
Working with Madeline on the hallway scene was really cool. We wanted to make something that felt not too stylized, but natural movement, something that we can repeat over and over.
The viewer may not necessarily see that the character has been choreographed, but they can tell that something's off and that there's like an uncanny shift.
I love the horror genre because it's a mischievous genre. You go see a horror movie, an audience enters a sort of contract that says, I'm here to be freaked out, I'm here to be traumatized, I'm here to be challenged in that way.
Candyman really tries to help you examine who is the monster. Is the monster the person that is seen in this skin? Or is the monster also outside of ourselves? Is it the system that is at play?
Put your hands up!
Mia has put together this seminal horror about racial violence with a focus on police violence. Horror, it is an important genre to be able to explore the real-life horrors of the world.
But a story like that, pain like that, lasts forever. That's Candyman.
Candyman was just like a real sort of urban legend when I was growing up. It felt very present. I lived across the street from the projects, and so for us, Candyman was just hanging out over, across the street from us. When I was growing up, I was really into horror films, and what was different about Candyman was that it wasn't in like a random suburb in anywhere USA. It was an urban story. It involved Black people, which was unique. In the canon of all the horror I was watching, it felt like sort of anything was possible.
It felt important that this Candyman be seen from a Black perspective, that it be told from a Black perspective. So that was meaningful to me, to have a Black director.
Nia's film, Little Woods, manages to really play with the ideas of serious, trenchant social issues and handling them in a non-didactic way. And at the same time, getting very, very close to characters who are in desperate situations. When we wanted to hire a director for this movie, we didn't want just your average horror director. By the way, we love a lot of horror directors, and Jordan Peele is a horror director. But that we wanted somebody who could really sink into this world that we were building, someone who could really work with what's ultimately a character piece.
When thinking about the original, I really wanted to keep all the weird, idiosyncratic, super specific energy of the first film. I mean, what I love about it is that it's basically a tone piece about a woman's failing marriage and how she loses her mind, with the backdrop of all this really intense history that she's trying to uncover and sort of sticks her nose into where she probably shouldn't have. And so I wanted to keep all of that energy, but shift the point of view. From a Black point of view, our characters are Black, the filmmakers are Black, and that was really important. As opposed to an outsider looking in, it's watching someone experience what's actually happening.
I saw Candyman when I was younger. It was one of those films every kid, or at least every little black kid, had seen. I have always been frightened of the Candyman legacy and him coming to get me or something. To actually, years later, be a part of continuing that story is really cool for me.
On every day or just the last one?
To be able to work with a young black woman who knows so much what she wants and has beautiful control over the set, she is truly, truly a force.
Nia's strength is she expresses her artistic vision and sort of lets the actors mold it, but she'll also step in to make sure that it's being guided with a gentle hand in the right direction. It's fun to know that I can just go and play with the knowledge that she'll lead me to where I need to go.
Nia and I, let's just say this, both our names include all three of the same letters. Yep, that's right. We have developed a collaborative bond throughout this process where we have an open exchange of ideas, and that carried through all steps of the process. Very much a testament to Nia's openness to just get into the weeds on every detail of the film.
The tone and the color of Candyman was something that Nia and I discussed really early on. She had photographs from the civil rights era that were these beautiful candy colors. When I first started doing research of Cabrini green, I found this image of one of the towers, and half of it was torn down, and you could see all the rooms inside, and they were all those same candy colors that Nia had showed me from those original images.
I didn't know Nia's visual aesthetic. When I started seeing some shots, it's like, oh snap, okay Nia, I see you.
I see Cabrini Green as a sort of focal point for the lore of Candyman in the context of our film. It's where Candyman was born, it's where every other Candyman is born. It's hallowed ground, as well as sort of being a hellmouth. It's where everything happens and everything is born, but also where these men and boys have died. When rewatching the first Candyman, the way I thought about it was these sorts of legends are not just to protect the community from the horrors within the community, but also from the horrors without. So if you're thinking about Cabrini Green, there's like the violence that's happening within it. In the first film, gang violence, and then there's the violence from the outside, which is usually in the form of policing or gentrification.
Horror films in particular have long been representative of social ills. That's where the source of horror is in our daily life, the things that really keep us up at night.
Candyman.
I think legends and stories being passed down is a way of contending with the horrors that we live with day to day and protecting ourselves and our children from the horrors that are within our communities.
At the top of the film, we meet Anthony McCoy. He's an artist from Chicago, Illinois. He's a painter.
Is this one of yours?
Yes. I think Anthony hopes to do provocative work, moving work, and can be a part of large conversations about culture, music, about politics.
I know exactly what I'm meant to be doing.
He is a guy who strives to be culturally relevant through his artwork.
Anthony's early work is edgier, it's cool, it's young, it's abstract, but it's also very on the nose about Black pain and trauma, which I think is also something that Black artists contend with. It's something that would definitely spark a gallerist's interest.
And since art is such a huge focus of our film, Anthony being an artist, Brianna being a dealer, it seemed critical to us to make sure that there was actual artists in the film and works that had social relevancy to even the content and thematics that we were investigating in the movie.
He's got a whole thing.
And when I was talking to Arnold about who would be an interesting artist to help us realize works that would have been hot in the contemporary art marketplace, he immediately suggested an artist that he knew really well, Cameron Spratley.
I made the first half of Anthony's artwork, the news paintings and these paintings behind me here. It was interesting to get into the mind of the character and make the work from before he goes crazy.
Anthony aspires to influence conversation. I think he aspires to make art that makes people uncomfortable. He doesn't want to give direct answers within his work. Work speaks for itself.
No, it speaks, all right.
He always wants to be provocative, and he doesn't mind if his work is complex.
I'm gonna get another drink.
He's always looking to have us zero in on what's really important now or what's historically been important that we may be looking over.
Anthony's piece, which I do think is good, by the way, is exploring this idea that you can have layers of the picture that exists in the same location, the same place.
Open up the cabinet and you see the painting of Sherman Fields being beaten by the police, closing it back and then interacting with yourself. And so I think that maybe Anthony would like for the viewer to sit with themselves on how that lands on them.
In this sort of group show, there's this back and forth between things that reflect you, that are mirrors, and things that are not mirrors, from an actual mirror to objects that are really shiny and you see your reflection. And something in particular about my work is that they don't mirror. You don't get your own reflection back when you look at them, so that you really have to deal with what they are as images and not just your image overlaid over them.
Nia and I were adamant that we loan and borrow works by real living Black artists from Chicago. So Nia and I did studio visits with every one of these artists, talking to them about their process, looking at work. It was almost like we were curating an exhibition.
It was so great to mix our fictional art with the art of these amazing Black artists. We got Hamza Walker to curate the show for us. He was able to get us such amazing pieces.
They basically asked if I could get into the mindset of a Black female curator in Chicago now, what kind of show would she do? It was quite beautiful that they actually wanted to get some kind of sense, not just for an art scene, but Chicago's art scene.
In the art world, cities like New York City, LA, Miami, Berlin sort of gobble up the attention, whereas Chicago is this incredible city for artists, for galleries, and for museums.
In Brianna's show, we were really blessed enough to get actual Chicago artists, and we're very grateful that they lent us their work. It's just really beautiful.
I think Chicago is so important to the original Candyman. I personally just love to be as specific as possible to the place that the story is set, and we really just felt like there was no need to go anywhere else to get art or to find artists. We wanted this movie to be for and about Chicago.
My name is Sherwin Ovid. I'm a painter and interdisciplinary artist based here in Chicago. The part they wanted me to represent was after his last show, and there's a bit of a decline in his career.
I mean, where'd you even find those paintings? Thrift store in the desert?
Those paintings that we see Anthony painting later on in the film are his form of exercising trauma out of his body and onto the canvas. And I think they tell the story of all of these young men who were heavily traumatized and paid for it with their lives.
Daniel Robitaille in the original film was also a painter, and it felt like it would be nice to continue that through line.
To have the protagonist be not just an artist, but a painter, as this artist is slowly being possessed with the spirit of Candyman. The paintings serve as a way of documenting this possession.
I brought him back.
Who?
The 6 paintings they commissioned were supposed to represent a slow decline of this character. They began with one piece that was a portrait of Daniel Robitaille, who was the original Candyman, and it was communicated to me that it would be something a bit more recognizable. As the series continued, it would become a lot more difficult to recognize the actual character's face. I started out with high flow acrylic that would allow itself to be bled. Then I started to transition into using oil paint in a very impasto style, which is very thick, heavy brush strokes that forms a kind of relief. So it's a bit more sculptural. In terms of character, that sharpness and visceral quality in the actual paint works to convey a different sensibility in terms of the violence.
When it came to the portraiture, we wanted to find someone who was really great with faces, and we thought Sherwin, the way he captured humanity with his paints, we just knew that he had to be the one.
The art world is about representation and about telling stories visually, and Candyman is a story that kids tell each other to scare themselves. For us, the cool thing about setting in the art world is that that's what art's about too. It's about telling a story through beauty to be provocative.
We're dealing with this whole issue of both kind of anonymity through multiplicity. And so we're overlaying the horrible cycle of violence on Black bodies as a repeating event that is sort of a never-ending passing of the baton. This idea of how we suppress emotion behind a thing that is instantly recognizable as a face without really being one.
It's not just about entertainment value, it's also about making something that's going to cause you to think and cause you to have conversations, similarly to the way Anthony would like for his art to speak to the world, making a meaningful piece of art.
Robert definitely is an artist. He has such a strong voice, and I hired him because of that voice. It was just about leaning into the unique sound, and so he brought some of his genius to this film.
In my early teens, I started reading Clive Barker novels and watching the films that were adaptations of those novels. So I already had a history there with the film Candyman itself. I lived in Chicago for about 13 years, and when I first moved here, I lived very close to Cabrini Green. So there was a relationship there. And I did go back and watch the original film, listen to the Philip Glass score, and considered quite a lot of things.
Big thing about the original score that I think is so important, it's just kind of the fact that Philip Glass did a score for a horror movie. And that's really like macabre and baroque, and I think that in itself is really important. So what I wanted to do was create something as unique and as idiosyncratic as the original score, but have it be in our own language, with our own voice. And Robert, I think, fulfilled that because that's what he does with his own work.
The project came to my attention when it was announced that Monkey Paw Productions had optioned the film. I was actually approached to see if I would have any interest in doing the score. My practice and my process is a little strange, and I think maybe they thought it would fit in lockstep with the film that they were making.
He uses a lot of voices in his work. That was really important to me because there's so much about the multiplicity of voices. The many people who are Candyman, the many people who share the story, who hear the story, and who say his name 5 times. I'm a really big fan of Hilda's work. Robert brought her into the fold. Robert recorded with her for the film.
I actually started right as they were location scouting, so they hadn't shot anything yet. I had started with some ideas and we're turning those things into them. Due to that, there's a fair amount of material that they already have in hand, certain cues that they're working with, placing in certain scenes. The whole process, it's something that will take a bit of time. It will take a few months to get it to where I want it. I have a lot of layers that I'd like to incorporate into the score.
Robert recorded a lot of different sounds in the space to focus the story in the place where everything is born, which is Cabrini Green.
I'm here today in the row houses in Cabrini Green, taking ambient recordings inside of certain spaces and just getting the natural sound, the wind, insects, helicopters going overhead, because it was important for me to be able to incorporate actual ambient sound from the locations into the body of the score so that the score and the sound live as a character in the film, which is something that's really important for me. Nia and I had spoken before I came on, and then ever since. It was nice for me to speak with her to get a sense of how she was feeling, the tone. After reading the script, that's one thing, but also hearing the intention from someone, then also I was able to illustrate for her conceptually how I wanted to approach things and integrate that into her vision.
If you kind of broke down the score, you could basically hear like who the bad guy in the movie is going to be from like early on, just because of the sounds in it or the construction. He did such an amazing job, and nothing else in the world sounds like it.
What excites me about the opportunity is the fact that it's a film that I grew up with. It's work that I'm very familiar with and have a kinship to. Being able to work with a production company like Monkey Paw, who have turned out really incredible work, it's really lovely. My name is Robert Ichiabri-Lowe, and I am the composer.
The shadow puppetry in the film, it started off as a way to do flashbacks without having to flash back to the original film. As we were developing the mythology and pushing it further and further, it ended up being a really great medium for telling the stories of the other Candyman. Manual Cinema created all of it.
I'm a big puppetry fan, and I've been a huge fan of shadow puppetry for a long time.
Jordan and I have been friends for 25 years. When it was time for us to go to college, I went to NYU to become a studio art major, and Jordan went to Sarah Lawrence. His major was puppeteering. Puppeteering has been something that was a big part of Jordan's creative process from when he was young. It's something that his mother is also really passionate about. In Jordan's relationship to storytelling, some of its very origins start with that art form.
There's a timelessness to them, a sense that the fire crackling behind them is tribal and therefore sort of pure in this kind of storytelling.
So when faced with the daunting challenge of exposition and flashback material, Jordan had this incredible idea, which is we should portray these moments in a completely different fashion. That was the impetus for the notion of how the shadow puppetry came to play. But it wasn't until we were boots on the ground in Chicago and our production designer, Cara Brower, was doing research to try to thread the needle on this element of the film.
Cara is an incredible talent. She was on the production team on Us. She just has such an incredible eye, an ability to make something out of nothing.
Cara discovered this incredible company that had been around for a long time called Manual Cinema that is a troupe of artists, a collaborative, that execute these incredible films, all analog, all made from cut paper.
They're all hand cut with an X-Acto blade.
First of all, Manual Cinema is such a talented group. They rarely ever hit a false note or technique.
Like cut vellum for the chair and then paper for the silhouette. We get some nice opacity.
Nia and I met with everyone from Manual Cinema, and we had seen their work and talked with them about our intentions with the film. They instantly connected with us on the material.
Nia really grabbed a hold of the medium and went for it with the vignettes that she created.
I wanted to be really careful about how we depict violence against Black people. This ended up being a really useful way to do that.
I think the key thing for Nia was the tone. And I think the hardest challenge that Manual Cinema had on this film was to strike a tone that was equal measures scary, unsettling, and cut from genre cloth, as well as a very sober, somber tone that addresses the historical violence that we were exhuming for the sake of these flashbacks.
The thing we just need to solve is how to place these buildings while allowing these Black people to come in.
And what they created, we could never have been prepared for how incredible they pulled this off.
The way Candyman exists over time, it feels like it really fit the piece and brings a real wonder to it.
Being such an old form of storytelling, shadow puppetry, it just connected even more to the lore, to the mythology that we were dealing with.
Hi, I'm Coleman Domingo, and I'm one of the stars of Candyman. I'm honored to be among experts from all walks of life to take part in today's conversation about the significance and the meaning of Candyman.
This is where it all began. The story of Candyman.
The legend is, if you say his name 5 times while looking in the mirror, he appears in the reflection and kills you. You should say his name. I dare you.
Candyman.
Candyman. Candyman.
No!
Candyman.
Say his name.
How's that?
My name is Tanana Reeve-Dew. I am an author and a screenwriter, and I teach Afrofuturism and Black horror at UCLA.
I'm Wendy Ashley. I'm a trauma psychotherapist. I am an educator. I'm a professor at CSUN.
My name is Yolo Akili Robinson. I'm the executive director and founder of BEAM, the Black Emotional and Mental Health Collective.
I'm Lorenzo Lewis, mental health advocate, also founder of the Confess Project, which is America's first mental health barbershop.
I'm gonna have you say Candyman straight to camera.
Hold on. Watch all the Black people leave. Candyman. 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 Okay, let's look at a clip from the film.
What is he?
Candyman ain't a he. Candyman's the whole damn hive.
There are others.
Samuel Evans, run down during the white housing riots of the 50s. William Bell, lynched in the 20s. But the first one, where it all began, the story of Daniel Robitaille. He made a good living touring the country painting portraits for wealthy families, mostly white, and they loved him. But you know how it goes. They love what we make, but not us. They beat him, tortured him. They cut off his arm and gave him a meat hook in the stump. But a story like that, a pain like that, lasts forever. That's Candyman.
He's real.
Candyman is how we deal with the fact that these things happen, that they're still happening.
I mean, the thing that comes up almost immediately for me is the reality of intergenerational racialized trauma, right? You just watch the history over and over. I mean, we could add to this. We could add Emmett Till, we could add Trayvon Martin, we could add Breonna Taylor, like to watch Black men continue to be victimized over and over and over again, and yet still warning each other about it. Of course it's real and tragic.
Naming names, say her name, say their names, listing the names, the tragedies, the traumas, and also expressing those traumas through the puppetry to give us a little bit of emotional distance. And even we don't have to see a puppet set on fire, It's just, it conveys the pain without soaking us in the pain.
Yeah, I mean, it brings up, personal experiences regarding how we often suppress our emotions around how things happen.
The first thing that came to mind was thinking about intergenerational trauma, right? The legacy of so many stories that Candyman symbolically represents. This continued legacy of violence against Black folks that has happened through, many ages. And I thought about the legacy of the land and the ways in which, you think about trauma and the land, and for Black folks, these sites of harm that continue to kind of reverberate when these things happen.
Why do you think it was important for Jordan Peele and Nia DaCosta to reframe this legend, this myth of Candyman, especially right now for our times?
But really what was fueling a lot of the fear around him was fear of Black masculinity, Black men, fear of the urban jungle. I mean, Cabrini Green itself is a monster. Really, some of the worst stereotypes around Blackness. So it was very, very important for Nia DaCosta and Monkey Paw to come and reframe a story about Black trauma through a Black lens, not through the white lens.
The monster is with violence against Black folks, right? And so we see that how the resonance of that harm contributes to the creation of Candyman, right? The real threat here is this kind of unaddressed, ongoing systemic and structural violence from white institutions, right?
Let's look at this soundbite from writer-producer Jordan Peele.
The very question of this eternal dance between monster and victim that is the racial history of this country is at the center of this movie. There's a perpetualness to the story of racial horror. It doesn't go away, it changes shape and it changes form, and it's elusive and it's sneaky, right? Candyman is an eternal figure, and this monster has been swept under the carpet for so long.
Racial trauma, just defined very simply, is the mental, emotional, psychological injury that comes from racial bias, discrimination, and anything like that. It shows up individually, right? Like denial of opportunities or lack of access to resources. It shows up interpersonally, right, through microaggressions. It shows up structurally or systemically, right, like police brutality. It shows up vicariously through watching videos of people get killed over and over and over again. Racial trauma goes through generations and it lives inside of us. In psychological fields, there is no diagnostic criteria for that. There is nowhere where it is written that people can receive treatment for this kind of lived experience. So it's not validated.
It's like a visual validation of that trauma. The intelligence of the way Monkey Paw in general approaches horror. but also especially in this film. But if you're gonna bring it here, you're gonna make it a story that's about a black man and a black trauma, then make it a story about black trauma. What I love about what Nia DaCosta has done and what this Candyman does is reclaims this trauma to tell it in a way that is soothing and healing and empowering for us, rather than just sort of you're passing by the lions in your car. We've suffered so much that when we go to a movie, which are ostensibly for entertainment on one level, right? You have to entertain first, teach second, right? How do we walk that line? How do we walk that line of creating the dread you need, the violence you need in a horror project without literally traumatizing the audience you're trying to service? This new Candyman is just brilliant at doing that.
Thank you. How is Candyman relevant in today's culture, especially as we've been dealing with so much cultural and social reckoning?
There's still a big conversation around are black people safe in today's society, right? The police brutality that happens and the imagery we see on TV, but also how we relate to this in our own neighborhoods, in our own backyard, in our own families.
The common trauma response, we talk about fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, right? All those different dimensions, and then you have to fight, right? Which I think Candyman represents in a lot of ways, right? The fight response, I'm gonna fight for my dignity. I'm gonna fight for reclamation, acknowledgement of the legacy of harm that's going on.
I think this is a question not only for Dr. Du, but many of us. There has been a rise in exploration of black horror. And then there's been commentary, whether it's on social media or, in back rooms and in corners, talking about how we show black trauma, how we show the brutalization of black bodies. What are your thoughts about it? Because I think that there's arguments on all sides, how this should be out in the world. But then I have questions like, who is it for? And what is the intention behind it? Go.
That is a beautiful question. Listen, as a horror lover and a creator, I'm just so excited for these times. Jordan Peele just really kicked that door open with Get Out and with Us. I mean, all kinds of marginalized black horror creators are getting their first chance to sit in the writer's room, their first chance to sell a screenplay. And in that, we have people who are new to the industry, people who are learning, people who sometimes weren't writing horror before, but they're like, oh, but racism is so horrifying. How do I convey that in horror? And we're at this sort of crossroads where we have this really exciting new subgenre that can say so much about our society and about history and racism. Can you actually directly translate that kind of horror to black faces? The Puppet Show is a perfect example of a way to convey a scene that's supposed to be violent without showing the violence. How do we make it more about dread? How do we make it more psychological horror? How do we use body horror, a loss of self? We like to be scared for fun, right? We like to learn and feel empowered through horror. And horror is all about trauma, but that doesn't mean you need to witness that trauma visually every time you go to a horror movie with a black cast.
Is that something that you think is specific for black people as well? Because I'm like, are we fine with seeing other bodies being brutalized? Or is it because of our trauma in this country that it's hard for us to take that?
I have to admit, and I'm a lifelong horror fan, it is harder for me to watch a black character die on a screen.
Absolutely.
It's just harder, and this is probably true for all marginalized populations. I would imagine that for white horror viewers who've been watching horror their whole lives, maybe it's different. I don't know that experience. I don't know what it's like to be in the majority. I don't know what it's like to have all the entertainment focused on you. But we are now just stepping into this spotlight, and it's so thrilling and exciting when we see ourselves. But then when we die, it does have a really deep personal cut.
Okay, let's look at a clip from the film.
Clive? Dad? Why are you sitting there?
Hey. I bet you didn't know your daddy could fly, did you? Well, I can.
When trauma happens to kids that age, it is a very different injury. Under 10, it's an internal, it's an intrapsychic injury. So your self is built around that. There's something really powerful about that piece of herself being built around trauma. As the movie goes on, you sort of see, I mean, it's very much buried, but it is very much there all of the time.
We're in this current political, social moment where there are more common conversations around Black mental health and trauma. And this film shows us our symptomology of distress and how they're showing up in our communities is directly correlated to the generations of racism and all those pieces. And I think there's something in the Candyman lore that helps illuminate that as well, you know?
There's something about that clip that always makes me think of Song of Solomon, where Black people can fly above their trauma in some way, shape, or form. And I think it's something there. Maybe that's what I impact when, hopefully you can impact anything with a film and like, that's how you relate to it. And like, maybe it was his hope that he could fly above his trauma.
It really feels that way. As I was watching the clip, I was thinking, oh, why would he do that with her there? Why would he tell her he could fly when he knows she's watching him? But you know, maybe on one level, he did hope and think he could fly.
Yeah.
That really makes the most sense out of that clip. I mean, he was in such pain, but you think he might have been able to pull it back because his daughter was there. He's not gonna want her to carry that. But maybe in some ways he thought he was carrying her with him, you know, into this miracle.
That I can rise above this.
Yeah.
I would love to see it that way, and I'm glad you said that because I want to see it that way.
The research shows that suicide is the third leading cause of death for Black men under the ages of 20. We recognize that people are really just crying and screaming inside, but they don't know how to really unveil that besides just making that one, you know, horrific move, jumping out of a window or so.
One of the things that I really, really admire about this Candyman is that it expresses trauma in such a visceral way. Well, the whole legend of Candyman, the body horror, the transformation, the stories, but it also treats it so gently on other levels. Like there are marginalized characters within this story who are not thrown away like you typically see in horror.
You have such a great representation of characters. You have queer characters, you have very complex, no one's monolithic in their experience.
And even as a story about relationships, your lover is having a serious mental problem, even that is treated with a kind of intelligence and gentleness and how we go about this situation.
In terms of the relationship between Brianna and Anthony, right? You see Anthony going into a space where his relevance is beginning to decline. And so as a coping strategy, he's driving himself deeper into his art, right? Which leads him to this Candyman lore. But you also see how Brianna, as a Black woman, is kind of doing the emotional labor of trying to pull him and navigate and support him through this piece. And that's really representative of so much what happens in our communities.
100%. She really reflects a strong Black woman, right? All of that sort of archetype that shows up to care give and to, you know, make sure that everything is okay. This idea that you have to try harder, you have to do more, you have to achieve higher, and shame that Black women carry around to their detriment.
Let's look at this soundbite from writer-director Nia DaCosta.
We knew we had to talk about gentrification as it related to Candyman because we were really passionate about going back to Chicago, and a lot of development has happened around Cabrini Green, but not necessarily in Cabrini Green itself. And so gentrification just had to be part of the tale because that's what's been happening in the neighborhood. And for me, I kind of looked at it as a force that we're all swept up in, a force that definitely is a form of violence, in particular how it affected this community.
We filmed a lot of the scenes of Candyman and the Cabrini Green project area. And it was a very interesting feeling while you were there because there's lots of chain link fences and you could tell that there was still some community still living there.
This takes me right back to the 30s and redlining, right? I mean, this is sort of where the gap in wealth came from, that where like physical maps were used to decide what areas were primarily Black and brown. There was no loans that were provided there. There was, you know, no one could buy homes in that area. And they were allowed to become impoverished, leading to mass incarceration, leading to poverty, leading to all sorts of substance use. Years and years later, folks are like, wait a minute, this is in the center of town.
I think of it less as gentrification. I think it more as almost like a recolonization of space. So now we're coming back, so we're going to displace everyone who's here. We're going to completely like uproot your communities, often destructively so, and then we're going to come in and rename the structure.
Well, reflection of systemic racism, right? Because then what happens is folks move in, restructure the neighborhood, jack up the prices, everyone who lives there can't live there anymore, and then we wonder why we have so many homeless people. It just perpetuates a cycle.
Who are you, man?
Well...
This is Anthony McCoy of 2 years ago. I want the Anthony McCoy of the future. I want the great Black hope of the Chicago art scene of tomorrow. Look, I really don't want to have to go through the trouble of replacing you in the summer show, but you're the only person who hasn't shown me what I'm actually putting up.
I'm thinking about doing something about the projects and about how white supremacy,
white people,
yeah, how it creates these spaces of of rampant neglect for communities of color, in particular black communities.
Yeah, like where you're from.
Yeah, Brownsville.
Southside is kind of played.
Or Cabrini Green.
My character, William, says, you know how it goes. They love what we make, but not us. Let's unpack that.
It doesn't matter how it reflects Anthony's creativity. It doesn't matter how it comes from a place inside of him. It needs to be acceptable. It needs to be presentable. It needs to make sense for somebody white for it to be okay.
I think that's what we're now starting to combat in our art. And because we have to get on the side of controlling that art and getting it out there in this way.
William is the griot for this community. William is left there to be the torchbearer, to tell the stories, to make sure the names are not forgotten.
He's unpacking his own black trauma.
He's a walking monument to that history.
We talk about the people, our elders in our communities. I think it shows up that I think young people watching this film can really feel powerful, knowing that these stories are still upheld in a way that's seeing the journey through.
He retold the story. He provided a muse for Anthony because of the stories and the connection. And yet we watched him slowly decompensate because of all the weight that he was carrying emotionally.
When you get down to how do we heal, I think just reflecting on our inner self, our experiences, and how does that help us to become better. But I also think beyond that is getting to this place of of acceptance. But I think that sometimes is hard for a lot of folks because of our past experiences, our current situations.
Healing is both an individual and a collective journey, right? I think that we have to do the work inside of ourselves. I think we have to do the work in context with other people. I do think that movies and books and art and creativity and then dialogue can be a place where we can find healing.
We as Black folks have always had tools and access to healing. Whether it's been our music, whether it's been our faith, whether it's been our art, we have always had tools for healing. The tool that I think is most important for me to lift up right now is talking about community care, because that's at the heart of the work that we do. This work of art really gives us an opportunity to use those skills as a way to kind of have a conversation that we can connect and build with each other to cultivate more community care systems.
I've been experiencing a practice of more mindfulness. It's all a part of all the things you're saying about building community, building trust, building more self-awareness, understanding your space and your place in the world. I think that's how we can all heal.
As an artist, of course, I always pivot to the arts. And as a horror fan, I'm thinking about my late mother, Patricia Stevens-Dew, who was a civil rights activist and who the whole time I knew her wore dark glasses because she had been hit in the face with tear gas during a demonstration in 1960. So she had this very physical trauma. She had the emotional trauma of multiple arrests. And she was the first horror fan of my life. It's because of her that I love horror and I write horror. And I think she gravitated to horror for healing, even though the horror of her era was not about her. She could extract healing from watching imaginary monsters get vanquished. It can help us heal. And I think certainly the remake of Candyman can help us heal.
Thank you all so very much for being here and contributing your own voices to this extraordinary conversation.